Okay. So we're going to focus today specifically on Judaism in American cinema. So just in terms of my background, I'm doing a Fulbright right now in Poznan at Adam Mickiewicz University. Before that, I was an undergraduate student in the southern United States where I looked at literature and gender studies. And I had a specific focus in my gender studies concentration on film. So I have a lot of experience with film studies and cinema studies. Furthermore, my great-grandparents were German Jews who immigrated to the United States in the early 1900s. So Judaism is definitely a part of my cultural identity and my heritage, so it's really spectacular that I get the opportunity to talk about the role that Jewish Americans played in cinema. So let's just get the ball rolling. Okay, so the question to start off with is, what is Jewish film? Does it mean film produced by Jewish people? Does it mean films about Jewish people? Does it mean films directed by Jewish people? Jewish actors, Jewish comedians? There's no one singular definition about what it means to be a Jewish film in the United States. So for our purposes, I'm thinking about how do we dissect that? How do we pull it apart from early film to contemporary in terms of the appearance of Jews and Jewish motifs? And it's important to distinguish that in the United States, Judaism is more of a cultural mentality rather than a religious mentality. There's lots of Jews who don't practice the religion Judaism, but are still Jews because their parents were Jews or their grandparents were Jews. So they would still consider themselves Jews, even though they may not practice Judaism. So for our purposes, we'll look at a lot of early stars who had Jewish parents, but who didn't consider themselves to be religious Jews. And so American Jews enjoyed, and we'll get to that in a second, enjoyed a very long history of living very openly as being Jews. It wasn't something that people felt they needed to disguise. They were Jews in government, they were Jews in education, they were Jews in entertainment. But in film, in the early years, there was a big attempt to make sure that Judaism wasn't an openly talked about thing. People might know you were Jewish, but you tried to somehow hide it while you were in pictures. You wouldn't play a Jewish character. There wouldn't be openly Jewish themes for the most part. So we'll look at that oddness. It doesn't necessarily make sense that there are so many Jews in Hollywood when it was founded, and yet so many people attempted to not appear Jewish. And then the last element that we're going to look at is what elements of Jewish identity connect to film? What themes do we see throughout Jewish film, and why is that significant? Alright, so just a brief history of Jewish people living in America. So the first Jews came to America from Portugal and Spain as refugees from the resurgence of the Inquisition in the 16th and 1700s, and mostly settled in the southern colonies. Charleston and Savannah, both in the southern United States, had very high concentrations of Jews. The oldest Jewish synagogue in the United States was actually in Providence, Rhode Island, which was founded as a secular colony, where people could come and live openly and practice whatever religion they wanted, in contrast to Puritan colonies like Massachusetts and Connecticut, or Catholic colonies such as Maryland. But again, many Jews began living in the southern colonies in cities like Charleston and Savannah, and in the 1740s, British Jews began to arrive in the United States as part of the laws that allowed British citizens to colonize North America. So for a very long period of time, as we see down here, this is just a picture of Jews living in New England. This is Benjamin Judah, who was a senator from the United States, from South Carolina, and who later, during the Civil War, would serve as Secretary of War for the Confederate States of America. So he was a very, Secretary of State, rather, for the Confederate States of America. So he was a very prosperous Jewish person who lived openly. And then during the immigration period in the late 1800s, there was a bigger surge of Eastern European and Central European Jews migrating to the United States, where they lived in urban areas. So this is where you're going to see the rise of cities like Miami, Chicago, and New York City becoming very heavily Jewish, and also very heavily immigrant, which is where our story begins. But again, just to show you that there's a very long history of Jews living very openly in the United States. They came there because there was a statement of tolerance. George Washington, shortly after he became president, wrote a letter to a very influential rabbi in which he said that the children of Abraham will always be welcome in the United States. There would never be laws prohibiting that, and never infringing on the open practice of their faith. The only incident of that actually occurred in the Civil War. So when Ulysses S. Grant invaded Tennessee as part of the Union's Anaconda strategy, of ending the Civil War. One of his first proclamations as he was leading martial law in Tennessee was expelling Jews. So he sent a letter around in which he blamed Jews for the rise of the Confederacy, accused them of being slaveholders, and said that all Jews in Tennessee need to leave. Abraham Lincoln got wind of it, lost his temper, said absolutely not, that's not how this is going to go down. But that was one of the first major incidences of anti-Semitism in the United States. There are other issues later with Leo Frank, who was accused of murder in the United States South and was lynched before he was brought up on trial. But by and large, Jews enjoyed pretty open status in the United States. We're very influential families. However, the immigrant part is what's most significant when we talk about film, as we'll get to right now. All right, so by the 1890s, there were over 2 million Jews who had immigrated to New York City from Europe. And vaudeville became a very popular form of entertainment. Since urbanization was on the rise, there were lots of small theaters, and Jewish and Yiddish theater became very common. And many early performers in vaudeville, such as Fanny Brice, Sophie Tucker, Mae West, the Marx Brothers, and the Three Stooges, were all Jewish. Mae West's mother was a Jew, her father was a Protestant, but Fanny Brice, who actually changed her name to sound less Jewish, the Marx Brothers, they were all Jews. Now, by the time film got started in the late 1800s and early 1900s, Judaism was depicted on film, but usually in very unflattering ways. So let's zoom in. So this is from a silent movie production of Oliver Twist, and this is the character Fagin, who is notorious in Dickens circles for being a Jewish character. And when he was depicted on stage, on screen rather, it was very unsympathetic. Like if you look at his features, it's an anti-Semitic caricature. He has sort of suspicious-looking eyes, a big hooked nose, bad teeth, and the scraggly beard. It's a very unflattering portrayal of Jewish stereotypes. And as we get more into film, the film industry, and I will pause this for just a moment, the film industry was initially controlled by Thomas Edison. And Thomas Edison didn't want other people moving in on the film industry. He declared sort of a monopoly where he was making all the films and sending them out across the United States. And depictions of Jews were common in these films, but again, they were very unflattering. Not just Jews, but immigrants in general, African Americans, Hispanic Americans were all sort of lampooned and made fun of in very stereotypical ways. So this is a 1907 film called The Fights of Nations, produced by Thomas Edison Studios, and it sort of shows a very backwards anti-Semitic attitude towards Jewish Americans, which coincided with Edison's vision. We'll skip ahead through the first part, which is about Spanish immigrant stereotypes. It's a very long fight, isn't it? Here we are. So, our Hebrew friends. Let's just watch and see. So this is a Jewish man peddling ties on the streets of New York City. And then another Jewish person confronts him about it. And it ends up in a fight. Notice the Gentile sort of pushing his way through. And we have a third Jewish person to add to the mix. It's like the beginning of a bad joke. Trying to get him to take sides in their argument. And the constable comes. And he's bribing the police officer. Alright, and so that's just an example of one of the earlier depictions of Jewish stereotypes in American film. And again, Edison held a monopoly. But the interesting fact is, and we'll look at this more in just a second, people were still going to the movies. Jewish audiences were still seeing these films and looking at these stereotypes. But as we see there, there's a very negative depiction of Jews as being corrupt, as squabbling, and of selling things. Like this idea of the Jewish vendor is a very common early motif of anti-Semitism. Like Walt Disney would even include this when he made his original version of the Three Little Pigs. The big bad wolf, when he's trying to get into the third house that's made out of bricks, in the Walt Disney version in 1933, he disguises himself as a Jewish peddler selling brushes. So there's this idea of Jews being sneaky, of being corrupt, venal, that they're willing to bribe authority figures to get what they want, and that it's also something of a conspiracy. But again, in the early stages, Jews were heavily involved in entertainment, both on stage and even in the early screen. Alright, so here's what changes. So Adolf Zucker is the first person to challenge Edison's monopoly. He is a Jewish immigrant from Hungary, and he eventually would found Paramount Films, which is today a giant in the film industry. And in 1912, filmmaking moves west. So the question is, why did filmmaking move from New York City and Chicago to Hollywood, where we associate it today? So Adolf Zucker believed that films should be designed for the middle class. Edison, as we saw, was making lowbrow films that he thought only poor people would pay money to go see. So lower class people were initially the ideal market for film. But Zucker thought, how can we challenge that? How can we move beyond it? And so he started making films where he would import stars from Europe, screen movies, and then show them on Broadway stages to audiences. Edison did not like this because it was infringing on his money, his rights. So he tried to conglomerate the film industry with him in charge, making a monopoly of it. Which, of course, according to antitrust laws in the United States, monopolies were against the law. So Edison was challenged for that in the court and lost. So he was ordered to end this conglomeration of film, but he still sort of had flunkies and cronies who were willing to go after the people who would still make films, which, as it happened, were a lot of Jewish Americans. So in 1912, production moved west to Hollywood. And this is where you're going to see the birth of the Big Six. So we have Samuel Goldwyn, William Fox, Carl Linnell, Adolf Zucker, Louis B. Mayer, and the Warner Brothers. And you can see all these together. Louis B. Mayer is a huge status in American film. Goldwyn and Mayer would eventually join to form MGM. Fox Studios still exists today. The interesting thing about these men, they were all Eastern European Jewish immigrants who were born within a 500-mile radius of each other in Europe. So they came to the United States, and this is where you're going to see the first influence of Jewish film with this idea of the outsider. These people already felt that they had to flee Eastern Europe and Russia to come to the United States for freedom, and then they sort of did it again. Going west to Hollywood sort of mirrored this idea that you would go somewhere else where you could be free to make money and do your own thing. Additionally, these men sort of embodied the American dream. They were not formally educated, they hadn't had glamorous jobs before. They worked in thrift shops, they'd sold clothes, and then they worked their way up to owning these big pictures and having a monopoly on the film industry well into the 1950s. So they're eventually going to form the Oscars, and this idea of the European Jew running Hollywood, quote unquote, the stereotype that Jews run Hollywood, is born, because the big production companies are owned by Jewish people. However, they don't necessarily immediately start showing Jewish themes. In the early 20s, which we'll look at more in a second, it was still sort of accepted. You could still depict these ideas on screen as part of an American culturalism, and the narrative of the immigrant is very important at this time, and we'll show a short clip that embodies this. This is a film that openly depicts Jewish life from an immigrant's perspective. We're not going to watch 84 minutes without it. No worries. So that's just a short excerpt that demonstrates the first depiction of the Jewish immigrant as a theme in film, of someone who is embodying the American dream and this idea of the American opportunity, that you can come to Europe and still make it big. And it's also progressive in the way that it is directly confronting the standards of living for immigrants, which at this time was still not necessarily very common. We moved past the idea of the immigrant slums by the 20s, but it's still something that people weren't willing to confront, the way that people lived once they came to America. However, the progress that we see in this early time ends abruptly. So influences on early Jewish film, by 1925, 75%, let's see if we can zoom in a little bit. 75% of Americans are going to the movies at least twice a week. They're very cheap, they're a very inexpensive form of entertainment, and as such, people are going to see them. The first talkie, the first film that's made in sound, is an Al Jolson movie called The Jazz Singer. Al Jolson was Jewish, and the film follows the story of an openly Jewish man who leaves his family and his home to become a popular jazz singer. His father is a cantor in a synagogue and expects his son will also be a cantor. However, he doesn't go along with that, he leaves and follows his dreams. So this is where we're going to see Jewish characters sort of disappearing. Even though The Jazz Singer is very successful, it's going to be the last film for a very long time where openly Jewish characters are depicted. So even though there's this void, many early stars of film are Jewish. A lot of the directors are Jewish immigrants. The producers are Jewish. So there's still a safe space for Jews to work in film. However, they're not necessarily allowed to be openly Jewish. So Danny Kaye, for example, who is a superstar in America, a very good singer and dancer, when he initially auditioned to be in films, the producer told him, have your nose fixed, you look too Jewish. Get your nose taken care of, come back, and we'll put you in the pictures. And that's what Danny Kaye had to do. And a lot of these stars had very Jewish-sounding names, immigrant names, which they changed when they wanted to appear in film. So they changed it to a more Americanized Gentile name, which is a very common trait up until the 1950s, which we'll get to in just a minute. As we said, they avoid sounding too Jewish. That doesn't mean that Jewish themes aren't present in this time. This is where the idea of the outsider becomes popular, as well as the American dream. And we're still able to see the influence on cinema. So let's just look at this first image. This is from Al Jolson's The Jazz Singer. Again, it's unabashed. It's very clear that he's Jewish, that the family is Jewish. And what's more, they don't necessarily show Jews as outsiders. They're showing customs, they're showing cultural elements of life in a way that's somewhat positive. But then that's sort of it. There's a void afterwards. And then a picture of Hedy Lamarr, openly Jewish, but Hedy Lamarr changed her name to sound less Jewish. Just an example of many stars who felt compelled to do that. And then we'll look at a short clip. So this is to look at the influence of vaudeville, which was still present from the Marx Brothers.
Watch the door for a few minutes, and don't let anyone in without the password.
All right, what is it?
Swordfish is the password, do you understand?
Okay, I got it.
Well, what is it?
Password.
Swordfish! Swordfish!
All right, the swordfish, the swordfish. Piazza Mascoso in the room for a faccio così pazzo. Who are you?
I'm fine, thanks. Who are you?
I'm fine too, but you can't come in unless you give the password.
Oh, what is the password?
Oh, no, you gotta tell me. Hey, I thought what I do, I give you 3 guesses. It's the name of a fish.
Is it Mary?
That's an old fish.
Here, but she drinks like one. Let me see. Is it sturgeon?
Hey, you crazy. Sturgeon, he's a doctor, cuts you open when you're sick. And I give you one more chance.
I got it.
Haddock. That's the funny. I got a haddock too.
What do you take for a haddock?
Well, now, sometimes I take an aspirin, sometimes I take a calomel.
I'd walk a mile for a calomel.
You mean chocolate calomel. I like that too, but you know, guess it. Hey, what's the matter? You don't understand English? You can't come in here unless you say swordfish. Now, I'll give you one more guess.
Swordfish. I think I got it. Is it swordfish?
That's it, you guess it.
Pretty good, huh?
Fine, you guess it.
What do you want? I want to come in. What's the password? No, you don't fool me. He said swordfish. No, I got tired of that. I changed it.
What's the password now?
See, I forgot it. I better come outside with you.
Alright, so this is just a clip from the Marx Brothers, who again, comedy giants at this time. who were still using these ideas from vaudeville and met with a lot of popularity. But as you can see, even though their last names were changed, Marx Brothers again switching from their original Jewish names, they're very popular. So Jewish entertainers, everyone's heard of the Marx Brothers. Jewish entertainers are not forbidden from being on stage, and they bring with them this trait of vaudeville, and we'll look at one more vaudevillian who made it big. This is Mae West. Everyone's heard of Mae West, the premier comedienne of the American stage, who changed her last name to appear less Jewish. Her mother was Jewish, she grew up in Brooklyn. But again, she's using all of these jokes and vaudeville tactics.
When I'm good, I'm very good. But when I'm bad, I'm better.
I see a man in your life.
What, only one?
I changed my mind.
Does it work any better? When I'm caught between two evils, I generally like to take the one I never tried.
I'll take care of these men.
Yes, give them all my address.
I am delighted. I have heard so much about you.
Yeah, but you can't prove it.
Haven't you ever met a man that can make you happy?
Sure. Lots of times.
What kind of husband did you think I should get?
Why don't you take a single man, leave the husbands alone?
Well, I can always tell a lady when I see one.
Yeah, what do you tell them? I had a shooter line once.
Really? Was he mad?
Well, he wasn't exactly pleased about it.
You were wonderful tonight.
I'm always wonderful at mine.
Aren't you forgetting that you're married?
I'm doing my best. What's the good of resisting temptation? There'll always be more.
I wish you'd forget your principles, Ruby. I must have you. Your golden hair, your fascinating eyes, alluring smile, and lovely arms. Your form divine.
Wait a minute. Is this a proposal or you take an inventory? You certainly know the way to a man's heart. Funny, too, because I don't know how to cook.
I'm sorry you think more of your diamonds than you do of your soul.
I'm sorry you think more of my soul than you do of my diamonds.
Do I bother you if I look over your shoulder?
No, do I bother you?
I'll never forget you.
No one ever does.
Well, it's better to be looked over than overlooked.
Great town, St. Louis. You were born there?
Yes.
What part?
Why, all of me.
How'd you do? Get your hair cut or have your ears moved down?
You know I've been mad about you from the first time I laid eyes on you. Well, you're my whole world. What do you want to do, drive me to a madhouse?
No, I'll call you a taxi.
Young lady, are you trying to show contempt for this court?
No, I'm doing my best to hide it.
I wonder what kind of a woman you really are.
Too bad, but I can't give out samples. I'll show up sometimes, see me.
Alright, so just some examples of Mae West. Again, a veteran of vaudeville who was more than happy to bring these tropes from vaudeville to American films. And again, very popular. But then in terms of social issues, a lot of films being produced right now, especially monster films, are very popular. King Kong, for example, where there's a lot of focus on this idea of the outsider and sympathizing with the outsider. So let's look at this iconic scene from King Kong and how this film can relate to the Jewish experience. However, this was produced by Universal Studios. It was a blockbuster at the time, a very, very popular film. So while there's no overt references to Judaism, there's still hinted at this focus on the Jewish experience, where King Kong is an outsider. He's someone brought from somewhere else to the United States, and there's this assault on him that ultimately makes him a sympathetic figure. Even though he's kidnapped Fay Ray, he's climbing to the top of the Empire State Building, he's not made out to be a complete monster. By the end of the film, when King Kong falls and dies, people feel sorry for this character. So they create this sense of sympathy for the outsider, rooting for the underdog, which is a very popular motif in American film that was given its incubus in this early period of Jewish American filmmaking. Right. So, Jewish films, let's zoom in on that. So by the 1950s, the Cold War is well at play. And a big rallying cry in the United States against communism is Christianity. So films about the Bible become